through the bond. She was strict about obedience to her orders, and while he knew she could not kill him, would not at least, punishment only required her to mask the bond so she did not share his pain. That, and a ward to muffle his screams. She disliked screaming almost as much as she disliked lightning. "It is just as well you're with me," she went on. A pity that the Aiel savages were still holding Farah, though she would have to quiz the white on exactly why she had sworn before she could be trusted. Until the journey to Kyrian, she had not known she shared anything with Farah. A very great pity that none of her own heart was with her. But only she had been sent to Kyrian, and she did not question the orders she received any more than Firil questioned those she gave. "I think a few people are going to have to die soon," as soon as she decided which ones. Firil bowed his head, and a jolt of pleasure came through the bond. He did like killing. "In the meanwhile, you will kill anyone who threatens the Dragon Reborn. Anyone." After all, it had become perfectly clear to her, while she herself was a captive of the savages. The Dragon Reborn had to reach Tarman Gaiden, or how could the Great Lord defeat him there?
Chapter 25. When to Wear Jewels. Perrin strode impatiently up and down the flowered carpets that floored the tent, shrugging with discomfort in the dark green silk coat he had seldom worn since Fail had had it made. She said the elaborate silver embroidery suited his shoulders, but the wide leather belt supporting his axe at his side, the one as plain as the other, only pointed out that he was a fool pretending to be more than he was. Sometimes he tugged his gauntlets tighter, or glared at his fur-lined cloak, lying across the back of a chair ready for him to put on. Twice he pulled a sheet of paper from his sleeve and unfolded it to study the sketched map of Malden while he paced. That was the town where Fail was being held. Jundon and Get and Hugh had caught up to the fleeing inhabitants of Malden, but the only useful thing they had gotten was this map, and making anyone pause long enough to provide that had been a chore. Those strong enough to fight were dead or wearing Guyshine white for the Shido. Those who remained to flee were the old and the very young, the sick and the lame. According to Jundon, the thought that someone might force them to return and fight the Shido had quickened their steps north toward Andor in safety. The map was a puzzle, with its maze of streets and the Lady's Fortress and the Great Cistern in the northeast corner. It tantalized him with possibilities, but they were possibilities only if he found a solution to the greater puzzle that was not shown on the map, the huge mass of Shido surrounding the walled town, not to mention 400 or 500 Shido wise ones who could channel. So the map went back into his sleeve, and he continued to pace. The red-striped tent itself made him chafe as much as the map, and so did the furnishings. The gilt-edged chairs that folded for storage, and the mosaic-topped table that did not. The stand mirror and the mirrored washstand, and even the brass-bound chests standing in a row along an outer wall. It was barely light outside, and all 12 of the lamps were lit, mirrors sparkling. The braziers that had held off the night's freezing cold still contained a few embers. He had even had Fail's 2 silk hangings, worked with lines of birds and flowers, brought out and hung from the roof poles. He had let Lamgwin trim his beard and shave his neck. He had washed and donned clean clothes. He had had the tent set up as if Fail were going to return any moment from a ride. Also, everyone would look at him and see a bloody lord. Look at him and feel confident. And every bit of it reminded him that Fail was not out riding. Tugging off one of his gauntlets, he felt in his coat pocket and ran his fingers along the rawhide cord tucked in there. 32 knots now. He did not need reminding of that, but sometimes he lay awake a whole night in the bedding that did not have Fail in it, counting those knots. Somehow, they had become a connection to her. Anyway, wakefulness was better than nightmares. "If you don't sit down, you're going to be too tired to ride to So Harbor, even with Niald's help," Berlane said, sounding faintly amused. "Just watching you is exhausting me." He managed not to glare. In a dark blue silk riding dress, a wide golden necklace studded with fire drops tied around her neck, and the narrow crown of Mayenne holding a golden hawk in flight above her brows, the first of Mayenne was seated atop her crimson cloak on one of the folding chairs with her hands folded around her red gloves in her lap. She looked as composed as an Aes Sedai, and she smelled patient. He did not understand why she had stopped smelling as if he were a fat lamb caught in brambles for her meal, but he almost felt grateful to her. It was good to have someone he could talk to about missing Fail. She listened and smelled of sympathy. I want to be here when Gaul and the maidens bring in some prisoners. The slip made him grimace as much as the delay. It was as if he doubted. Sooner or later they would capture some of the Shido, yet apparently that was no easy matter. Taking prisoners did no good unless they could be brought away, and the Shido were only careless compared to other Aiel. Sulin had been patient too, explaining it to him. It was getting so hard for him to be patient, though. What's keeping Arganda? He growled. As if the Gildanan's name had summoned him at last, Arganda pushed through the entry flaps, his face like stone and his eyes sunken. He looked as though he slept as little as Perrin. The short man wore his silvery breastplate, but no helmet. He had not shaved yet this morning, and graying stubble grizzled his chin. Dangling from one gauntleted hand, a fat leather purse clinked as he set it on the table alongside two already there. From the Queen's strongbox, he said sourly. He had said little the last 10 days that was not sour. Enough to cover our share and more. I had to break open the lock and put 3 men to guard the chest. It's a temptation to the best of them, with the lock broken. Good, Perrin said, trying not to sound too impatient. He did not care whether Arganda had to set 100 men guarding his Queen's strongbox. His own purse was the smallest of the 3, and he had gleaned every bit of gold or silver he could find to make it up. Slinging his cloak around his shoulders, he picked up the purses and brushed past the man out into the gray morning. To his disgust, the camp had taken a more permanent air, though it was not by design, and there was nothing he could do about it. Many of the Two Rivers men slept under tents now, pale brown patched canvas rather than striped red like his, but big enough for 8 or 10 men each, with their ill-assorted pole arms stacked at the front. And the others had turned their temporary brush shelters into sturdy little huts of woven evergreen branches. The tents and huts made at best meandering rows, not at all like the rigid lines seen among the Gildanan and Mayeners, yet it still looked a little like a village, with paths and lanes through the snow trampled down to bare frozen earth. A neat stone fire ring surrounded each of the cook fires, where clusters of men stood cloaked and hooded against the cold, waiting for their breakfast. It was what was in those black iron cook pots that had Perrin moving this morning. With so many men hunting, game was growing thin on the ground, and everything else was running out. They were down to searching for squirrels' hordes of acorns to grind for stretching the oatmeal, and this late in the winter, what they found were old and dried out at best. The sour mixture felt belly after a fashion, but you had to be hungry to get it down. Most of the faces Perrin could see were watching the cookpots eagerly. The last of the carts were rattling through a gap made in the ring of sharpened stakes around the camp, the carrion and drivers swathed to their ears and hunched on their seats like dark sacks of wool. Everything the carts had held was stacked in the center of the camp. Empty, they lurched in the ruts left by the carts ahead, a single file disappearing into the surrounding forest. Perrin's appearance with Berlain and Arganda at his heels caused a stir, although not among the hungry Two Rivers men. Oh, a few made cautious nods in his direction. 1 or 2 fools gave rough bows, but most still tried not to look at him when Berlain was in the vicinity. Idiots. Stone-brained idiots. There were plenty of other people, though, gathered a little way from the red-striped tent, crowding into the lanes between the other tents. An unarmored Mayener soldier in a gray coat came running with Berlain's white mare, bowing and bending to hold her stirrup. Anura was already up on a sleek mare, almost as dark as Berlain's mount was pale. Thin beaded braids hanging down her chest from the collar of her cloak, the Aes Sedai barely seemed to notice the woman she was supposed to advise. Back stiff, she peered fixedly toward the low Aiel tents, where nothing moved but the thin wavering lines of smoke rising from the smoke holes. One-eyed Galen, in his red helmet and breastplate and eye patch, made up for the Tarabana sisters' inattention, though. As soon as Berlain appeared, he barked an order that stiffened 50 of the winged guards to statues, long red-streamered steel-tipped lances upright at their sides. And when she mounted, Galen snapped another command that put them on their horses so smoothly they seemed to move as one. Arganda directed a frown toward the Aiel tents, frowned at the Mayeners, then stalked over to where as many Gildanan lancers waited, in shining armor and conical green helmets, and spoke softly to the fellow who would be commanding them, a lean man named Kirayan, who Perrin suspected was nobly born from the haughty gaze visible behind the face bars of his silvered helmet. Arganda was short enough that Kirayan had to bend to listen to what he had to say, and the necessity frosted the taller man's face even more. One of the men behind Kirayan was carrying a staff with a red banner bearing the 3 six-pointed silver stars of Gildan, instead of a green streamered lance, and one of the winged guards carried Mayen's golden hawk on blue. Aram was there too, though off to one side and not ready to ride. Wrapped in his bright green cloak, sword hilt rising behind his shoulder, he shared his jealous scowls between the Mayenners and the Gildanin. When he saw Perrin, the man's scowl turned sullen, and he hurried off, blundering through the 2 riversmen waiting for their breakfast. He did not pause to offer apologies when he bumped someone. Aram had grown increasingly touchy, snapping and sneering at everyone but Perrin as the days passed and they sat and waited. Yesterday, he had almost come to blows with a pair of Gildanin over something none of them could quite recall once they were separated, except that Aram said the Gildanin had no respect, and they said he had a bad mouth. That was why the former tinker was staying behind this morning. Things were likely to be touchy enough in So Harbor, without Aram starting a fight when Perrin was not looking. "Keep an eye on Aram," he said quietly when Daniel brought up his pay. "And keep a close eye on Arganda," he added, stuffing the purses into his saddlebags and buckling the flaps down tight. The weight of Berlane's contribution balanced his and Arganda's together very nicely. Well, she had cause to be generous. Her men were as hungry as anyone else. "Arganda looks like a man ready to do something stupid to me." Steya frisked a little and tossed his head as Perrin took the reins, but the stallion settled quickly under a firm, gentle hand. Daniel rubbed his tusk-like mustaches with a cold, reddened knuckle and eyed Arganda sideways, then exhaled heavily in a mist. "I'll watch him, Lord Perrin," he muttered, giving his cloak a hitch. "But no matter what you said about me being in charge, as soon as you're out of sight, he won't listen to a thing I say."
Chapter 21. A Mark. Alviar.
Chapter 25. When to Wear Jewels. Perrin strode impatiently up and down the flowered carpet. "He first," Bulwer said in that dry voice, ducking a bow in his saddle, the sparrow bobbing on a branch. His eyes flickered toward the eye. "Keep a close eye on Arganda," he added, stuffing the purses into his saddlebags and buckling the flaps down
Skipped ahead
tight.
a little bit.
The weight of Berlane's contribution balanced his and Arganda's together very nicely. She had cause to be generous. Her men were as hungry as anyone else. "Arganda looks like a man ready to do something stupid to me." Steya frisked a little and tossed his head as Perrin took the reins, but the stallion settled quickly under a firm, gentle hand. Daniel rubbed his tusk-like mustaches with a cold, reddened knuckle and eyed Arganda sideways, then exhaled heavily in a mist. "I'll watch him, Lord Perrin," he muttered, giving his cloak a hitch. "But no matter what you said about me being in charge, as soon as you're out of sight, he won't listen to a thing I say." Unfortunately, that was true. Perrin would rather have taken Arganda with him and left Galen here, but neither had been willing to accept that. The Gildanin did accept that men and horses would begin starving soon unless food and fodder were found somewhere. He did not let himself spend a day farther from his queen than he already was. In some ways, he seemed even more frantic than Perrin, or maybe just more ready to give in to it. Left to himself, Arganda would have been edging a little nearer the Shido every day until it was right under their noses. Perrin was ready to die to free Fahil. Arganda just seemed ready to die. "Do what you can to keep him from doing anything stupid, Daniel." After a moment, he added, "As long as it doesn't come to blows." There was only so far he could expect Daniel to restrain the fellow, after all. There were 3 Gildanin for every 2 rivers man, and Fahil would never be freed if it came to them killing each other. Perrin very nearly rested his head on Steyer's flank. Light, but he was tired, and he could not see any place ahead of him anywhere. A slow clump of hooves announced the arrival of Missouri and Seonid, with their 3 warders riding close behind, wrapped in cloaks that made most of each man vanish, along with part of his horse. Both Aes Sedai wore shimmering silk, and a heavy gold necklace, layers of thick strands, showed under the edge of Missouri's dark cloak. A small white jewel dangled onto Seonid's forehead from a fine golden chain fastened in her hair. Anura relaxed, settling more easily in her saddle. Back among the Aiel tents, the wise ones stood in a line, watching. 6 tall women with their heads wrapped in dark shawls. The people of So Harbor might be about as welcoming to Aiel as the people of Malden would have been, but Perrin had not been sure the wise ones would let either sister come alone. They had been the last reason for waiting. The sun was a red-gold rim in the treetops. "The sooner there, "The sooner back," he said, climbing into the bay's saddle. As he rode through the gap that had been made to let the carts out, 2 Rivers men were already beginning to replace the missing stakes. No one left for wariness with Massima's people nearby. It was 100 paces to the tree line, but his eye caught movement, someone on a horse slipping away into the deeper shadows beneath the towering trees. One of Massima's watchers, no doubt, racing to tell the prophet that Perrin and Berlain had left the camp. No matter how fast he rode, though, he could not be in time. If Massima wanted Berlain or Perrin dead, as seemed likely, he would have to wait on another opportunity. Galen was not about to take any chances, though. No one had seen hide nor toenails of Santes or Gendar, Berlain's 2 thief-catchers, since the day they failed to return from Massima's camp. And to Galen, that was as sure a message as their heads in a sack. He had his lancers spread in a sharp-eyed ring around Berlain before they reached the trees. And around Perrin, too, but that was only incidental. Given his wishes, Galen would have brought all 900 or so of his winged guards, or better yet, in his view, talked Berlain out of going. Perrin had tried that as well, with no better luck. The woman had a way of listening, then doing exactly as she wished. Fail was like that, too. Perrin just had to live with it. Most of the time, since there was nothing else to do. The huge trees and stone outcrops sticking out of the snow broke up the formation, of course, but it was still a colorful sight, even in the dim light of the forest. Red streamers floating on light airs and slanted beams of sunlight, red-armored riders vanishing momentarily behind massive oaks and leather leaves. The 3 Aes Sedai rode behind Perrin and Berlain, followed by their warders, all watching the woods around them, and then the man with Berlain's banner. Girayan and the banner of Gildan came a little behind, his men dressed in neat, shifting lines, as near as they could manage. The forest's openness was a deception, and ill-suited to neat lines and bright banners, but add in embroidered silks and gems and a crown, and warders in those color-shifting cloaks, and it was a most impressive sight. Perrin could have laughed, though without much mirth. Berlain seemed to sense his thought. "When you go to buy a sack of flour," she said, "wear plain wool so the seller thinks you can't afford to pay any more than you must. When you're after flour by the wagon load, wear jewels so she thinks you can afford to come back for all she can lay hands on." Perrin snorted a laugh in spite of himself. It sounded very much like something Master Luhan had told him once, with a nudge in the ribs to say it was a joke.
Going too
the look in his eye that said it was a little more.
Just chilling.
Dress poor when you want a small favor,
Smoking a little bit, chilling.
He was very glad Berlain no longer smelled like a hunting wolf. At least that took one worry off his mind. They soon caught up to the tail end of the carts, a line that was no longer moving by the time they reached the traveling ground.
Hell yeah, big
Axe
blue
work
fan,
and
that's
sweat
good.
had removed the trees,
I'm not doing
sheared
too
off by
bad.
gateways, and made
Can't
a little
complain.
clearer. But it was crowded even before Galen spread his ring of lancers
Still
around,
trying
facing
to get
outward. Page and Neald was there already.
good money together
Office
to get
Varandian with its
another
mustache
webcam
waxed to
so I can
points
start
on
doing
double
my
gelding. His coat
my
would do for
diamond
anyone who had
painting
not seen an
again.
Ashaman before. The only other one he had was black as well, and at least he had no collar pins to mark him out. The snow was not deep, but the 22 Rivers men led by Will Alcine were on their horses too, rather than standing and waiting for their feet to freeze in their boots. They looked a whole lot like the fellows who had left the 2 Rivers with him, longbows slung across their backs, bristling quivers and swords of various descriptions at their belts. Perrin hoped he could send them home soon. Or better,
I'm hoping
take
so
them home.
too.
Most were balancing a pole arm over their
I
saddles.
figure it'll
Adel-Kar,
happen
Flan Barsteer,
eventually.
carried banners, Perrin's own
I've got to be
and the Red Eagle of Manetheren.
a little patient.
Todd's heavy jaw was set stubbornly, and Flan, a tall, skinny fellow from up to Watch Hill, looked sullen. Likely he had not wanted the job. Maybe Todd had not either. Will gave Perrin one of those open, innocent looks that fooled so many girls back home. Will liked too much embroidery on his coat at feast days, and he purely loved riding ahead of those banners, probably in the hope some woman would think they were his.
I think I might have some
But Perrin let
patience
it
then.
pass.
When I get
He
another
had not
one, it'll
expected
be,
the other 3 people in the
it'll be
clearing
a
any more
decent
than
one
he had the
instead of what I
banners.
got.
Holding his cloak around him as if the mild breeze were a gale,
Because,
Bulwer clumsily healed
When
his
I
blunt
bought
nose
it,
roam
I got it
forward
on
to meet
eBay.
Perrin.
It was like
2 of Fael's hangers on
$15 the
trailed
best
after him with
offer.
defiant expressions.
So.
Midori's blue eyes
get
looked
what you
odd
pay
in her
for.
dark Tyran face, but then her coat, with its puffy green-striped sleeves, looked odd on her bosomy frame. The daughter of a High Lord, she was every inch a noblewoman, and men's clothing just did not suit her. Latian, Karienin, and pale in a coat almost as dark as Niald's, though marked with 4 slashes of red and blue across the chest, was not much taller than she, and the way he sniffled with the cold and rubbed at his sharp nose made him look much less competent. Neither wore a sword, another surprise. "My lord, my lady first," Bulwer said in that dry voice, ducking a bow in his saddle, a sparrow bobbing on a branch. His eyes flickered toward the Aes Sedai behind them. That was the only sign he gave that he was aware of the sisters. "My lord, I recalled that I have an acquaintance in this So harbor, a cutler who travels with his wares, but he may be at home, and I've not seen him in several years." This was the first time he had ever mentioned having a friend anywhere, and a town buried in the north of Altara seemed a peculiar place for it, but Perrin nodded. He suspected there was more to this friend than Bulwer was letting on. He was beginning to suspect there was more to Bulwer than the man let on. "And your companions, Master Bulwer?" Berlane's face stayed smooth inside her fur-lined cowl, but she smelled amused. She knew very well that Fail had used her young followers as spies, and was sure that Perrin made the same use of them. "They wanted an outing, my lady first," the bony little man replied blandly. "I will vouch for them, my lord. They've promised to cause no trouble, and they may learn something." He smelled amused, too. A musty smell, of course, coming from him, though with a touch of irritation. Bulwer knew she knew, which did not please him, but she never made open reference to the fact, which did. There was definitely more to Bulwer than he let on. The man must have his reasons for taking them along. He had managed to take up all of Fail's young followers one way and another, and had them eavesdropping and watching among the Gildanan and the Mayenners and even the Aiel. According to him, what your friends said and did could be as interesting as what your enemies planned. That was when you were sure they were your friends. Of course, Berlane knew that her people were being spied on, and Bulwer knew she knew that too. And she knew that he... It was all too sophisticated for a country blacksmith. "We're wasting time," Perrin said. "Open the gateway, Nield." The Ashaman grinned at him and stroked his waxed mustaches. Nield grinned too much since the Shido were found. Maybe he was eager to come to grips with them. He grinned and gestured grandly with one hand. "As you command," he said in a cheerful voice, and the familiar silvery slash of light appeared, widening into a hole in the air. Without waiting for anyone else, Perrin rode through into a snow-covered field surrounded by a low stone wall and rolling country that seemed almost treeless compared with the forest he had left behind. Just a few miles from So harbor, unless Nield had made a substantial error. If he had, Perrin thought he might pull those fool mustaches right off the man's face. How could the fellow be cheerful? Soon, though, he was riding west beneath a gray, cloudy sky, along a snowy road with the high-wheeled carts trundling along in a line after him, and early morning shadows stretching ahead. Stair tugged at the reins, wanting to run, but Perrin held him to a steady walk, no faster than the cart horses could manage. Galen's Mayenners had to cross fields beside the road to maintain their ring around him and Perrin, getting past the low walls that divided field from field. Some had gates from one farmer's property to the next, probably to allow sharing plow teams. Others jumped flamboyantly, their lances flying, risking their animals' legs and their necks. Perrin cared less about their necks, in truth. Will and the 2 fools carrying the wolf head and the red eagle joined the Mayenner bannermen behind the Aes Sedai and warders, but the other 2 riversmen strung themselves out flanking the line of carts. There were far too many carts for fewer than 20 men to guard, yet the cart drivers would feel easier seeing them. Not that anyone expected brigands, or Shido for that matter, but no one felt comfortable outside the protection of the camp. In any case, the other would be able to see any threat well before it reached them. The low rolling hills did not really allow a very long view, but it was farm country, thatch-roofed stone houses and barns scattered among the fields, and nothing of wildness about it anywhere. Even most of the small thickets clinging to the slopes were coppiced for firewood. But it struck Perrin suddenly that the snow on the road ahead of him was not fresh, yet the only tracks were those made by Galen's foreriders. No one moved around any of those dark houses and barns. No smoke rose from any of the thick chimneys. The countryside seemed absolutely still and absolutely empty. The hair on the back of his neck stirred, trying to stand. An exclamation from one of the Aes Sedai made him look over his shoulder, and he followed Masuri's pointing finger north to a shape flying through the air. It might have been taken for a large bat at first glance, sweeping eastward on long-ribbed wings. a strange bat with a long neck and a long thin tail trailing behind. Galen barked an oath and pressed his looking glass to his eye. Perrin could see it well enough unaided, and even make out the figure of a human being clinging to the creature's back, riding it like a horse. Shon-Chen, Berylane breathed. Both her voice and the smell of her worried. Perrin twisted in his saddle to watch the thing's flight until the glare of the sunrise made him turn away. Nothing to do with us, he said. If Niald had made a mistake, he would strangle the man. Chapter 26. In So Harbor. As it happened, Niald, who had had to remain to hold the gateway open till Kirayan and the Gildanin were through, had placed the hole in the air very close to where he aimed. He and Kirayan caught up at a gallop just as Perrin topped a rise and drew rein with the town of So Harbor in front of him, on the other side of a small river, crossed by a pair of arching timber bridges. Perrin was no soldier, but he knew right away why Masima had left this place alone. Hard against the river, the town had two massive stone walls dotted with towers around it, the inner rising taller than the outer. A pair of barges were tied to a long wharf that ran along the river wall from bridge to bridge. Yet the wide bridge gates, iron-strapped and closed tight, seemed to be the only openings in that expanse of rough gray stone, and battlements topped the whole length of it. Built to hold off greedy neighboring nobles, So Harbor would have had little fear of the prophet's rabble, even if they came by thousands. Anyone wanting to break into this town would need siege engines and patience, and Masima was more comfortable terrorizing villages and towns without walls or defenses. Well, it's glad I am to see people on the walls over there, Niald said. I was beginning to think everyone in this country was dead and buried. He sounded only half joking, and his grin looked forced. As long as they're alive enough to sell grain, Kirayan murmured in his nasal voice. Unbuckling his silvery white-plumed helmet, he lifted it down to the tall pommel of his saddle. His eyes swept past Perrin and paused briefly on Berylane before he twisted around to address the Aes Sedai in the same weary tone. Are we going to sit here or go down? Berylane arched an eyebrow at him, a dangerous look, as a man with any brains would see. Kirayan did not see. Perrin's hackles were still trying to stand, the more so since seeing the town. Maybe it was just the part of him that was wolf, disliking walls. But he did not think so. The people atop the walls pointed toward them, and some held looking glasses. Those, at least, would be able to make out the banners clearly. Everyone would be able to see the soldiers, with the streamers on their lances floating on a morning breeze, and the first few carts of the line that stretched down the road out of their sight. Maybe everyone from the farms was crowded into the town. We didn't come here to sit, he said. Berylane and Anura between them had laid out how to approach So Harbor. The local lord or lady had surely heard of Shido depredations not many miles to the north of them, and they might have heard of the prophet's too. Either thing was enough to make anyone wary. Together, they might be enough to make people loose arrows and wait till after to ask who they had shot. In any case, it was highly unlikely they would welcome outland soldiers through their gates at the moment. The lancers remained spread along the rise, to show that these visitors possessed some armed might, even if they chose not to employ it. Not so that So Harbor would be overly impressed by 100 men, but the burnished armor of the Gildanin and the red armor of the winged guards said the visitors were not wandering tricksters. The Two Rivers men would impress no one until they used their bows, so they remained back with the carts to hold up the cart drivers' spirits. It was all an elaborate bit of nonsense, fluff and feathers, but Perrin was a country blacksmith no matter who called him lord. The first of Mayenne and an Aes Sedai should know what they were about in a thing like this. Galen led the way down to the river at a slow walk, bright crimson helmet resting on his saddle, his back straight. Perrin and Berylane rode a little way behind, with Seona between them, and Masuri and Anura to either side. The Aes Sedai with their hoods thrown back, so anyone on those walls who could recognize an Aes Sedai face would have the opportunity to see three. Aes Sedai were welcome to most places, even where people really would rather not. At their backs came all four bannermen, with the warders spaced among them in their eye-wrenching cloaks. And Kirayan, with his shining helmet balanced on his thigh, sour-mouthed at being relegated to riding with the warders, and now and then glaring coldly down his nose at Balwar, who trailed at the rear with his two companions. No one had told Balwar he could come, yet no one had said he could not. He bobbed a bow whenever the nobleman looked at him, then went back to studying the town walls ahead. Perrin could not shake his uneasiness as they drew nearer the town. The horse's hooves clattered hollowly on the southernmost bridge, a wide structure that rose high enough above the swift-flowing river to let a barge like those tied to the wharf pass easily underneath on sweeps. Neither of the broad, bluff-bowed craft had any provision for stepping a mast. One of those barges had settled deep in the water, slanting against taut mooring ropes, and the other somehow looked abandoned too. A rank, sour smell in the air made him rub at his nose. No one else seemed to notice. Near the foot of the bridge, Galen drew up. Black iron straps at his blocks, forced to pause anyway. "We have heard of the troubles plaguing this land," he bellowed at the men atop the wall, managing formality at the top of his lungs. "But we are merely passing through, and we come for trade, not trouble. To buy grain and other needful things, not to fight. I have the honor to announce Berlain Sir Peandrag Peyron, first of Mayenne, blessed of the light, defender of the waves, high seat of House Peyron, come to speak with the lord or lady of this land. I have the honor to announce Perrin to Bashir Ibarra." He tossed in Lord of the Two Rivers for Perrin, and several other titles that Perrin had no more right to, and had never heard before. Then went on for the Aes Sedai, giving each the full honorific, and adding her Aja as well. It was a very impressive recital. When he fell silent, there was silence. In the crenellations above, dirty-faced men exchanged bleak looks and fierce whispers, shifting crossbows and polearms nervously. Only a few wore helmets, or any sort of armor. Most were in rough coats, but on one man, Perrin thought he saw what might have been silk under a layer of grime. It was hard to tell with so much caked dirt. Even his ears could not make out what they were saying. "How do we know you're alive?" a hoarse voice shouted down at last. Berlain blinked in surprise, but no one laughed. It was fool talk. Yet Perrin's hair on the back of his neck really was standing stiff. Something was very wrong here. The Aes Sedai seemed not to sense it. Then again, Aes Sedai could hide anything behind those smooth masks of serenity. The beads in Anora's thin braids clicked faintly as she shook her head. Masuri ran an icy gaze along the men on the wall. "If I must prove I am alive, you will regret it," Siona denounced loudly in crisp Kyrianan accents, a little more heated than her face suggested. "If you continue to point that crossbow at me, you will regret it even more." Several of the men hastily raised their crossbows to point at the sky. Not all, though. More whispers rustled along the top of the wall, but someone must have recognized Aes Sedai. At last, the gates squealed open on massive rusty hinges. A gagging stench swept out of the town. The stink Perrin had been smelling, only stronger. Old dirt and old sweat, decaying middens and chamber pots too long unemptied. Perrin's ears tried to lie back. Galen half lifted his red helmet as if to replace it on his head before urging his done through the gates. Perrin booted Stayer to follow, easing his axe in its belt loop. Just inside the gate, a filthy man in a torn coat poked Perrin's leg with a finger, then darted back when Stayer snapped at him. The fellow had been fat once, but his coat sagged and his skin hung loose. "Just wanted to be sure," he muttered, scratching his side absently. "My lord," he added a tick late. His eyes seemed to focus on Perrin's face for the first time, and his scratching fingers froze. Golden yellow eyes were not a common sight, after all. "Do you see many dead men walking?" Perrin asked wryly, trying to make a joke of it as he patted the bay's neck. A trained warhorse wanted to be rewarded for protecting his rider. The fellow flinched as if the horse had bared his teeth at him again. His mouth twitched into a rictus smile, and he edged sideways, until he bumped solidly into Berlain's mare. Galen was right behind her, still looking ready to don his helmet, his one eye trying to watch 6 ways at once. "Where can I find your lord or lady?" she demanded impatiently. Mayenne was a small nation, but Berlain was unaccustomed to being ignored. "Everyone else seems to have gone mute, but I heard you use your tongue. Well, man, speak up." The fellow stared up at her, licking his lips. Lord Cowan is away, milady." His eyes darted toward Perrin, then flickered away. "The grain merchants, say what you want. They can always be found at the Golden Barge. That way." He thrust out a hand, pointing vaguely deeper into the town, then suddenly scrambled away, looking back over his shoulder at them as though fearful of pursuit. I think we should find somewhere else, Perrin said. That fellow had been afraid of more than yellow eyes. This place felt askew. We are already here, and there is nowhere else, Berlin replied in a very practical tone. In all that stink, he could not catch her scent. He would have to go by what he heard and saw, and her face was calm enough for an Aes Sedai. I have been in towns that smelled worse than this, Perrin. I'm sure I have. And if this Lord Callan is gone, it won't be the first time I've dealt with merchants. You don't really believe they've seen the dead walking, do you? What was a man to say to that without sounding a pure woolhead? In any case, the others were already crowding through the gates, though not in any neat array now. Winter and Alhara heeled Sionid like mismatched guard dogs, the one fair, the other dark, and both ready to rip out throats at the blink of an eye. They certainly had the feel of So Harbor. Kirkland, riding beside Missouri, looked unwilling to wait for that eye to blink. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword. Garayan had a hand to his nose and a glare in his eye that said someone was going to pay for making him smell this. Midori and Lation looked ill too, but Bulwer merely peered about, tilting his head, then drew the pair of them off into a narrow side street leading north. As Berlin said, they were there already. The colorful banners looked decidedly out of place as Perrin rode through the cramped, winding streets of the town. Some of the streets were actually quite wide for the size of So Harbor, but they felt close, as if the stone buildings on either side somehow loomed higher than their 2 or 3 stories, and were about to topple on his head to boot. Imagination made the streets seem dim, too. It had to be imagination. The sky was not that gray. People filled the dirty stone paving, but not enough to account for all the farms in the area being abandoned, and everyone scurried, heads down, not hurrying toward something, hurrying away. No one looked at anyone else. With a river practically on their doorsteps, they had forgotten how to wash, too. He did not see a face without a coating of grime, or a garment that did not look to have been worn for a week, and hard work in muck with it. The stink only worsened the deeper into the town they rode. He supposed you could get used to anything in time. Worst of all was the quiet, though. Villages were quiet sometimes, if not so still as the woods, but a town always had a faint murmur, the sound of shopkeepers bargaining and people going about their lives. So Harbor did not even whisper. It barely seemed to breathe. Getting better directions was difficult, since most people darted away if spoken to, but eventually they dismounted in front of a prosperous-appearing inn, 3 stories of neatly dressed gray stone under a slate roof with a sign hanging out front announcing the Golden Barge. The sign had a touch of gilt on the lettering, and on the grain mounted high in the barge and uncovered as it never would be for shipping. No grooms appeared from the stable yard beside the inn, so the bannermen had to serve as horse holders, a task that did not make them happy. Todd put so much attention into peering at the flow of dirty people that scurried by and fondling the hilt of his short sword that Stayer very nearly got a couple of his fingers when he took the stallion's reins. The Mayenner and the Gildanon seemed to be wishing they had lances rather than banners. Flan just looked wild-eyed. In spite of the morning sun, the light did seem shadowy. Going inside did not make things any better. At first glance, the common room bore the inn's prosperity, with polished round tables and proper chairs instead of benches, standing beneath a high, stout-beamed ceiling. The walls were painted with fields of barley and oats and millet, ripening under a bright sun, and a colorfully painted clock stood on the carved mantel above a wide fireplace of white stone. The fireplace was cold, though, the air nearly as icy as outside. The clock had run down and the polish dulled. Dust lay on everything. The only people in the room were 6 men and 5 women, huddling over their drinks around an oval table, larger than the rest, that stood in the middle of the floor. One of the men leaped to his feet with an oath, face paling underneath the dirt, when Perrin and the others entered. A plump woman with lank, greasy hair shoved her pewter cup to her mouth and tried to gulp so fast that wine spilled over her chin. Maybe it was his eyes. Maybe. "What happened in this town?" Honora said firmly, tossing back her cloak as though a fire blazed on the hearth. The calm gaze she ran across the people at the table froze every one of them. Abruptly, Perrin realized that neither Missouri nor Sionid had followed him inside. He doubted very much that they were waiting in the streets with the horses. What they and their warders were doing was any man's guess. The man who had jumped up tugged at his coat collar with a finger. The coat had been fine blue wool once, with a row of gilded buttons to his neck. But he appeared to have been spilling food down the front of it for some time, maybe more than had gone into him. He was another whose skin hung slack. Happened, said I, he stammered. Be quiet, Michael, a haggard woman said quickly. Her dark dress was embroidered on the high neck and along the sleeves, but dirt made the colors uncertain. Her eyes were sunk in pits. What makes you think something happened, Aes Sedai? Anura would have continued, but Berelain stepped in as the Aes Sedai opened her mouth again. We are looking for the grain merchants. Anura's expression never changed, but her mouth snapped shut with an audible click. Long looks passed between the people around the table. The haggard woman studied Anura for a moment, quickly passing on to Berelain and obviously taking in the silks and fire drops, and the diadem. She spread her skirts in a curtsy. We are the Merchants' Guild of So Harbor, milady. What's left of... Breaking off, she took a deep, shuddering breath. I am Rahima Arnan, milady. How may we serve you? The merchants seemed to brighten a little on learning that their visitors had come for grain and other things that they could supply, oil for lamps and cooking, beans and needles and horseshoe nails, cloth and candles, and a dozen things more that the camp needed. At least they grew a little less fearful. Any ordinary merchant, hearing the list Berelain gave, would have been hard-pressed not to smile greedily. But this lot... Mistress Arnan shouted for the innkeeper to bring wine. The best wine! Quickly now! Quickly! But when a long-nosed woman stuck her head hesitantly into the common room, Mistress Arnan had to rush over and catch her soiled sleeve to keep her from vanishing again. The fellow in the food-stained coat called for someone named Sparrow to bring the sample jars, but after shouting 3 times with no response, he gave a nervous laugh and darted into a back room to return a moment later, his arms around 3 large cylindrical wooden containers that he sat on the table, still laughing nervously. The others wore a collection of twitching smiles as they bowed and curtsied Berelain to a seat at the head of the oval table, greasy-faced men and women scratching at themselves without appearing to notice what they were doing. Perrin tucked his gauntlets behind his belt and stood against a painted wall, watching. They had agreed to leave the bargaining to Berelain. She was willing to admit, reluctantly, that he knew more of horseflesh than she, but she had negotiated treaties covering the sale of years of the oilfish harvest. Anura had smiled thinly at the suggestion that a jumped-up country lad might take a hand. She did not call him that. She could milord him as smoothly as Masuri or Sionid. Yet it was clear she thought some things clearly above his ability. She was not smiling now, standing behind Berelain and studying the merchants, as if to memorize their faces. The innkeeper brought wine, in pewter cups that had last seen a polishing cloth weeks ago, if not months, but Perrin only peered into his and swirled it in the cup. Mistress Vadir, the innkeeper, had dirt under her fingernails and embedded in her knuckles like part of her skin. He noticed that Galen, standing with his back to the opposite wall and one hand on his sword hilt, only held his cup too, and Berelain never touched hers. Kirayan sniffed at his, then drank deeply and called for Mistress Vadir to bring him a pitcher. Thin stuff, to be called your best, he told the woman through his nose, and looking down it. But it might wash away the stink. She stared at him blankly, then fetched a tall pewter pitcher to his table without saying a word. Kirayan apparently took her silence for respect. Master Crossan, the fellow in the food-stained coat, unscrewed the tops of the wooden containers and spilled out hulled samples of the grain they had to offer in piles on the table. Yellow millet and brown oats, the barley only a little darker brown. There would have been no rain before the harvest. The finest quality, as you can see, he said. Yes, the finest. The smile slid off Mistress Arnan's face, and she jerked it back. We sell only the finest. For people touting their wares as the finest, they did not seem to bargain very hard. Perrin had watched men and women back home selling the wool clip and the tabak to merchants down from Berlan, and they always disparaged the buyers' offers, sometimes complaining the merchants were trying to beggar them when the price was twice what it had been the year before, or even suggesting they might wait till next year to sell it all. It was a dance as intricate as any at a feast day. I suppose we might lower the price further for such a large quantity, a balding man told Berelain, scratching at his gray-streaked beard. It was cut short, and greasy enough to cling close to his chin. Perrin wanted to scratch his own beard just watching the fellow. It's been a hard winter, a round-faced woman muttered. Only 2 of the other merchants bothered to frown at her. Perrin set his wine cup down on a nearby table and walked over to the gathering in the middle of the room. Anura gave him one sharp warning glance, but several of the merchants looked at him curiously and cautiously. Galen had made his introductions all over again, but these folk were not entirely clear where Mayenne was exactly, or how powerful, and the Two Rivers only meant good Tabak to them. Two Rivers Tabak was known everywhere. If not for the presence of an Aes Sedai, his eyes might have set them running. Everyone fell silent as Perrin scooped up a handful of millet, the tiny spheres smooth and vivid yellow on his palm. This grain was the first clean thing he had seen in the town. Letting the grain spill back onto the table, he picked up the lid of one of the containers. The threads cut into the wood were sharp and unworn. The lid would fit tightly. Mistress Arnon's eyes slid away from his, and she licked her lips. "I want to see the grain in the warehouses," he said. Half the people around the table twitched. Mistress Arnon drew herself up, blustering. "We don't sell what we don't have. You can watch our laborers load every sack on your carts if you wish to spend hours in the cold." "I was about to suggest a visit to a warehouse," Berylane put in. Rising, she drew her red gloves from behind her belt and began tugging them on. "I would never buy grain without seeing the warehouse." Mistress Arnon sagged. The bald-headed man put his head down on the table. No one said anything, though.
Stupid.
The dispirited merchants did not bother to fetch their cloaks before leading them into the street. The breeze had picked up to a wind, cold as only a late winter wind could be,
Excuse me.
when people were already thinking ahead to spring, but they did not seem to notice. The hunch of their shoulders had nothing to do with cold. "Can we go now, Lord Perrin?" Flann asked anxiously when Perrin and the others appeared. "This place makes me want a bath." Anura gave him a frown in passing that made him flinch like one of the merchants. Flann tried a placating smile on her, but it was a sickly effort and too late for anything but her back. "As soon as I can arrange it," Perrin said. The merchants were already scurrying down the street, heads down and not looking at anyone. Berylane and Anura managed to follow without appearing to rush, gliding along, one as composed as the other, two fine ladies out for a stroll and never mind the filth underfoot or the stink in the air, or the dirty people who started at the sight of them and sometimes all but ran away as fast as they could. Galen had finally donned his helmet and openly held his sword hilt with both hands, ready to draw. Urayan was carrying his helmet on his hip, his other hand occupied with his wine cup. Contemptuously eyeing the grimy-faced folk who hurried by, he sniffed at the wine as if it were a pomander to fight off the stench of the town. The warehouses were located on a stone-paved street, barely wider than a wagon, between the town's two walls. The smell was better there, close to the river, but the wind-blown street was empty except for Perrin and the others. There was not even a stray dog to be seen. Dogs disappeared when a town grew hungry, but why would a town with enough grain to sell be hungry? Perrin pointed to a two-story warehouse chosen at random, no different from any other, a windowless stone building with a wide pair of wooden doors held shut by a wooden bar that could have done for a ceiling beam at the Golden Barge. The merchants suddenly recalled that they had forgotten to bring men to lift the bars. They offered to go back for them. The Lady Berylane and Anura Sedai could rest in front of the fire at the Golden Barge while workmen were fetched. They were sure Mistress Vidir would lay a fire. Their tongues went still when Perrin placed his hand beneath the thick beam and shoved it up out of the wooden brackets. The thing was heavy, but he backed up with it to give him room to turn and toss it down the street with a crash. The merchants stared. This might have been the first time they had ever seen a man in a silk coat do anything that could be called work. Urayan rolled his eyes and took another sniff at his wine. "Lanterns," Mistress Arnon said weakly. "We'll need lanterns or torches if—" A ball of light appeared floating above Anura's hand, glowing bright enough in the gray morning to cast everyone in faint shadows on the paving and the stone walls. Some of the merchants put hands up to shield their eyes. After a moment, Master Crossan tugged one of the doors open by an iron ring. The smell inside was the familiar sharp scent of barley, almost strong enough to overcome the stench of the town. And something more. Small, dim shapes slunk away into the shadows ahead of Anura's light. He could have seen better without it, or at least deeper into the darkness. The glowing ball cast a large pool of light and walled off what lay beyond. He smelled cat, closer to feral than not, and rat, too. A sudden squeal in the black depths of the warehouse, suddenly cut off, spoke of cat meeting rat. There were always rats in grain barns, and cats to hunt them. It was comforting and normal. Almost enough to soothe his uneasiness. Almost. He smelled something else. A smell he should know. A fierce yowl deep in the warehouse turned to rising cries of pain that died abruptly. Apparently, the rats of So Harbor sometimes hunted back. Aaron's hackles stirred again, but surely there was nothing here the Dark One would want to spy on. Most rats were just rats. There was no need to go very far in. Coarse sacks filled the darkness in high, slant-sided stacks on low wooden platforms to keep the stacks off the stone floor. Rows and rows of stacks piled nearly to the ceiling, and likely the same on the floor above. If not, this building still held enough grain to feed people for weeks. Walking to the nearest stack, he drove his belt knife into a pale brown sack and sliced down through the tough jute fibers. A flood of barley corns spilled out, and, clear in the glow of Honora's brilliant light, wriggling black specks. Weevils, almost as many as there were barley corns. Their scent was sharper than that of the barley. Weevils. He wished the hair on his neck would stop trying to rise. The cold should have been enough to kill weevils. That one sack was proof, and his nose knew the smell of weevils now, but he moved to another stack, then another and another, each time slicing open one sack. Each released a spill of pale brown barley and black weevils. The merchants were standing huddled together in the doorway, daylight behind them, but Honora's light cast their faces in sharp relief. Worried faces. Despairing faces. "We would be most happy to winnow each sack we sell," Mistress Arnon said unsteadily, "for only a slight additional, for half the last price I offered." Berling cut in sharply. Wrinkling her nose in disgust, she moved her skirts clear of the weevils scuttling among the grain on the floor. "You will never get all of them." "And no millet," Perrin said grimly. His men needed food, and so did the soldiers, but the millet grains were hardly bigger than the weevils. Winnow as they would, he would bring back weevils and millet in equal weight. "We'll take extra beans instead. They get winnowed too." Suddenly someone shrieked outside in the street. Not a cat or a rat, but a man in terror. Perrin did not even realize he had drawn his axe until he found the haft in his hand as he pushed through the merchants in the doorway. They huddled closer together, licking their lips, and not even trying to see who had screamed. Kirayan was backed up against the wall of a warehouse across the way, his shining helmet with the white plume lying on the pavement beside his wine cup. The man's sword was half out of the scabbard, but he seemed frozen, staring with bulging eyes at the wall of the building Perrin had just come out of. Perrin touched his arm, and he jumped. "There was a man," the Gildanan said uncertainly. "He was just there. He looked at me and—" Kirayan scrubbed a hand over his face. Despite the cold, sweat glistened on his forehead. "He walked through the wall. He did. You must believe me." Someone moaned. One of the merchants, Perrin thought. "I saw the man too," Seon had said behind him, and it was his turn to give a start. His nose was useless in this place. Giving the wall Kirayan had indicated a last glance, the Aes Sedai stepped away from it with a palpable unwillingness. Her warders were tall men, towering over her, but they stayed only far enough away to gain room to draw their swords. Though what the grim-eyed warders were to fight if Seonid was serious, Perrin could not imagine. "I find it difficult to lie, Lord Perrin," Seonid said dryly when he expressed doubt. But her tone quickly became as serious as her face, and her eyes were so intent that they alone began to make Perrin feel uneasy. "The dead are walking in So Harbor. Lord Cowlin fled the town for fear of his wife's spirit. It seems there was doubt as to how she died. Hardly a man or woman in the town has not seen someone dead, and a good many have seen more than one. Some say people have died from the touch of someone dead. I cannot verify that, but people have died of fright and others because of it. No one goes out at night in So Harbor or walks into a room unannounced. People strike out at shadows and surprises with whatever is to hand, and sometimes they have found a husband, wife, or neighbor dead at their feet. This is not hysteria or a tale to frighten children, Lord Perrin. I have never heard of the like, but it is real.
Be right back.
You must leave one of us here to do what we can." Perrin shook his head slowly. He could not afford to lose an Aes Sedai if he was to free Fail. Mistress Arnon began to weep even before he said, "So Harbor will have to face its dead alone." But fear of the dead only explained so much. Maybe people were too frightened to think of washing, but it seemed unlikely that fear would take everyone that way. They just did not seem to care anymore. And weevils, thriving in winter, in freezing cold? There was worse wrong in So Harbor than spirits walking, and every instinct told him to leave at a dead run without looking back. He purely wished that he could. Chapter 27. What Must Be Done. The winnowing took place on a snowy eastern riverbank, where there was nothing to cut the sharp north wind. Men and women from the town hauled sacks across the bridges in 4-horse wagons and 1-horse carts, even barrows pushed by hand. Normally buyers brought their own wagons to the warehouses, or at worst the grain and dried beans only had to be carried as far as the wharf. But Perrin had no intention of sending his cart drivers into So Harbor. Or anyone else, for that matter. Whatever was wrong in that town might be catching. Anyway, the drivers were uneasy enough as it was, frowning at the dirty townsfolk, people who never spoke but laughed nervously when they accidentally met someone's eye. The grimy-faced merchants overseeing the work were no better. In the driver's native Kyrian, merchants were clean, respectable people, at least outwardly, who very seldom twitched just because someone moved at the corner of their vision. Between merchants with a tendency to peer suspiciously at anyone they did not know, and townsfolk who dragged their feet recrossing the bridges, clearly reluctant to go back inside their own walls, the cart drivers were right on edge. They gathered in little clusters, pale, dark-clad men and women, gripping the hilts of their belt knives and peering at the taller locals as if at murderous madmen. Perrin rode about slowly, watching the winnowing, examining the row of carts that stretched up the rise and out of sight waiting to be loaded, or the town's wagons and carts and barrows rolling across the bridges. He made sure he was in plain view. He was not sure why the sight of him pretending to be unconcerned should settle anyone else's nerves, yet it seemed to. Enough that no one started running, at least, though they continued to look askance at the people of So Harbor. They kept their distance, too, and just as well. Let the notion that some of those folk might not be alive get into the Kyrianans' heads, and half would whip up their cart horses to flee then and there. Most of the rest might not wait much past dark. That sort of tale could twist anyone's head come night. The wan sun, nearly hidden by gray overcast, still sat less than halfway to its noonday peak, yet increasingly it was obvious they would have to be there through the night. Maybe more than one. His jaw knotted with the effort of not grinding his teeth, and even Niall began to avoid his scowls. He did not snap at anyone, he just wanted to. It was an arduous process, the winnowing. Every last sack had to be opened and emptied onto large flat wicker baskets, each of which took 2 people to toss the grain or beans. The cold wind carried away weevils in a shower of black flecks, and men and women with woven 2-handed fans added to the gusts. A swift current swept away everything that was blown into the river, but soon the snow on the riverbank was trampled underfoot, and the gray slush layered with insects dead or dying from the cold, and a liberal coating of oats and barley speckled with red beans. There was always a new layer to replace what feet mashed into the snow. What was left in the baskets seemed cleaner, though, if not entirely clean, when it was poured back into the coarse jute bags, which had been turned inside out and beaten fiercely with sticks by children to shake out vermin. The refilled sacks went into the Kyrianans' carts as soon as the tops were tied, but the piles of empty bags grew at a prodigious rate. He was leaning on the pommel of Stayer's saddle, trying to calculate whether it was taking 2 whole cartloads from the warehouse to fill one of his carts with grain, when Berylane brought her white mare up beside him, holding her scarlet cloak close against the wind with one red-gloved hand. Anura reined in a few paces away, her ageless face smooth and unreadable. The Aes Sedai appeared to be giving them privacy, yet she was close enough to hear anything above whispers, even without any tricks of the power. Smooth face or no, her beak of a nose gave her a predatory look today. Her beaded braids seemed some strange eagle's lowered crest. "You cannot save everyone," Berylane said calmly. Away from the stink of the town, her scent was sharp with urgency and razor-edged with anger. "Sometimes you must choose. So Harbor is Lord Cowland's duty. He had no right to abandon his people." Not angry with him, then. Perrin frowned. Did she think he felt guilty? Balanced against Fail's life, the troubles of So Harbor could not budge the scales a hair. But he turned his bay so he was looking at the gray town walls across the river, not the hollow-eyed children piling up empty sacks. A man did what he could, what he had to. Does Anura have an opinion on what's happening here? He growled. Quietly, but somehow he had no doubt the Aes Sedai heard. I've little idea what Anura thinks, Berelain replied, making no effort to lower her voice. She not only did not care who overheard.
Alright, everyone. I'm going to call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. Excuse me. But I want to thank all y'all for y'all support. So until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.